Well, good evening, everyone here watching us live on YouTube, and everyone that will be watching this later. This is, as you have noticed, today I'm not speaking Portuguese. This is our first live event in English here at the APPH, the APPH. Our conversation today, called Ecologies of Contamination, has been prepared to you all by Luísa Muccillo and Luísa Beck. And we have with us our distinguished guests here, Alex Blanchette and Celia Lowe. We are very happy to have them here. Before I let everyone go on, I just want to say that we are very happy to start with these conversations, what will be a few years long, years in the making, and it will be a few years long as a project in the following years in this collaboration with the Anthropocene curriculum that is, as most of you should know, organized by the HKW, Haus der Kulturen der Welt, or the House of World Cultures in Berlin, and the Max Planck Institute für Wissenschaftsgeschichte, or the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, also in Berlin. And they have been organizing since 2013 the Anthropocene curriculum, and this is our first collaboration with them, with a few to come. This activity itself, the Cosmic Conversations, this is the second time we organized them. Last year, we had also a trio of conversations with Brazilian researchers, and this time we're hosting these international Cosmic Conversations with today a few guests from the US, but we'll have a few guests from other countries as well. The project, most importantly, this project is an opportunity for us as a research group in the APPH. Our research group is the research group in the ecology of practices. And we've been working since 2016 with all these topics of ecology, philosophy, politics, and so on. And in 2021, we organized these Cosmic Conversations to talk about the ideas of land, the earth, the planet, its inhabitants, and their representations. And this first meeting today will continue the work that we started in the Cosmic Conversations last year. We hope that you have a good time, and that you also, you can check out all the information for these conversations and the past conversations on our website, apph.com.br/cc. And with that said, I think that's all I wanted to say. I'll let Luísa and Luísa take the conversation from my hands.
Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you, Fernando.
Welcome, everyone.
Welcome, guys. So tonight, as Fernando said, we are hosting very proudly the Professor Alex Blanchette and Celia Lowe. So welcome, and thank you for being with us this evening. So Blanchette has been researching industrial agriculture and the industrial pig in the United States, and last year published a wonderful book called Porcopolis, American Animalities, Standardized Life and the Factory Farm. And Celia has been researching biodiversity conservation in Southeast Asia, and in 2006 published her book called Wild Profusion, Biodiversity Conservation in an Indonesian Archipelago. And more recently, Celia has been mapping emergent forms of biosecurity in the context of the avian flu outbreaks, the H5N1 influenza, also in Indonesia. We planned some questions, and we will make them in the first hour and a half or so of tonight's talk. And after that, we will open the conversation for some of our public's questions. So anyone watching can ask us in either English or Portuguese on the YouTube chat, and we will translate the question if necessary. And as usual, we will start asking Celia and Alex to present themselves and talk about their research. But first, we would like to make a brief recap of last year's conversation, the one called Multispecies Landscapes, COVID-19 and Agribusiness. Last year, we talked with Jean Segata and Ana Paula Perrota, about the intense contamination with the new coronavirus, not so new coronavirus, among workers in slaughterhouses in different regions of the world, but especially in the United States, Germany, and Brazil. We also talked about the stigmatization of non-modern farms and practices as places of precariousness, delay, risk, and danger, while industrial agriculture aims to embody the discourse of safety, technique, welfare, and hygiene standards.
So we know that both places are a source of risk, but a discourse of technique and rationalization disqualifies an entire heterogeneous production network that does not correspond to the parameters of industrial factory farms. The relationship between animals and humans has always been possible, dangerous, and susceptible to the appearance of virus and bacteria capable of making people and animals sick. For example, in Europe, before the industrialization, there were many cases of tuberculosis in meat production. However, as an animal production becomes industrialized, the sanitary issue becomes even more central since it makes the international meat market possible. That without refrigeration and other food safety protocols would not be. So if the international market is viable, the issue of health security, which was already a problem, becomes a fundamental concern. After 9/11, especially, the fear of biological attacks increased and health became militarized and a problem of state security. This process is followed by the intensification of productive sector, which makes room for new, unpredictable, and unknown pathogens. We are used to hearing that about 70% of new infectious disease are expected to come from our relationships with animals. So if clandestine meat and raw milk, for example, can bring brucellosis and tuberculosis, diseases that are already somewhat controlled and identified, the industrial production system has much broader and more complex consequences.
So tonight, then, we would like to continue this discussion, and we ask you, how do you think your individual research connects with these themes?
Alex, do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Alphabetically, I think you.
Sure, I'll take it. Well, thank you all. Thanks so much for having us and all of the work you put into organizing this. These fantastic questions. I'm really excited to be in dialogue with Celia, whose research has had a profound influence on my own. I'll talk briefly about my book, assuming many in the audience have not read it, and then try to get to your question. So my book, Porkopolis, in a sense, is a portrait of everyday life and labor in an area of the Great Plains of the United States that annually produces about 7 million hogs from across all phases of life to death. As I understand it, it's an effort to ethnographically inhabit and move through vertical integration. And vertical integration is simply one corporation, in this case, owning every stage in the genetics, conception, birth, killing, and processing of animals. I would argue that what sets aside industrial agribusiness, at least in the United States, for animals since the 1980s is a renewed attempt at vertical integration, at more and more companies trying to control every single phase of pigs' lives and deaths. And really the book moves through all of those phases, especially from a portrait of everyday labor, working with very different kinds of pigs, whether we're talking about piglets or boars, breeding boars, or the various states of animal carcasses. One of the main premises of my work that I think I ended up bringing to the research was that I don't really consider industrial meat to be something new. It's not something that just emerges in the 1980s, the 1960s. Yes, it changes with time, But I think to understand this industry as I encountered it, we have to think that, industrial slaughterhouses in the United States have been a thing since for at least 150 years, right? Henry Ford famously took the idea for the automobile assembly line from the Chicago meat packers disassembly line. And I say that because I entered this community in 2010, 2009, really expecting to find a 7 million pigs produced in a 100-mile radius region, expecting to find a situation on the ground that was really worked out, that was refined and so forth. And instead, I think I continuously encountered a story of corporate fragility in a very specific way. That many managers who ran these operations were flummoxed by the fact, or frustrated by the fact, that they couldn't spot any obvious avenues to grow, to expand, to increase their profit margins and so forth. And they were really, in a sense, stuck in what some agricultural economists would call commodity economics, right? That there's become so much competition amongst corporations, especially since the 1970s or 1980s, to all produce the exact same thing, like just pork is pork is pork, and they're only competing on price. The companies that I studied, and it's not only them, but the companies I studied were trying to distinguish themselves from this commodity economic story. They were trying to create a form of competitive advantage over other corporations around the world. And that was by trying to realize an incredibly uniform and standardized hog. One that they could sell more broadly to wholesalers, that they could charge a premium for, and one that would give them a sort of sense of distinction. And what I found over the course of my ethnography, and what I relate in the book, is to create these incredibly uniform animals at the scale of 7 million, beings that grow to 285 pounds in 6 months with a very regular distribution of tendons and fat, necessitates a great deal of human labor, and particularly intimate human labor. It really requires to get these animals more and more and more uniform over time, more and more aspects of animals' existence to become kind of mediated or affected by labor. And so en route, this becomes a place that, where a very small town in the United States, where all of a sudden there's thousands of people all working on pigs, and where it really becomes something of a company town where pig proliferation and death is at the center of human life. Factory farms, as I argue in the book, as I experience them, are as much about reshaping human life to make it amenable to the mass production and proliferation of pigs as it is about shaping pigs' lives. I really expected to see a perhaps narrow discourse around finding new animal feeds, finding new genetics and so forth. But time in and time out, as I'll talk about later on today, I encountered managers that were really concerned that their workers' out of work habits, living arrangements, orientations towards pigs was inadequate to sustain this kind of fragile model of concentrating this many animals in place. And so briefly, I think that starts getting me to your question. And something that when you first invited me to this, I think we were using the term zoonoses or zoonotic diseases. That's to say, diseases that transfer across species that Celia's looked so closely at. And I had to just reply that at the end, I'll say this at the outset, I have very little knowledge of zoonotic disease. My book was released, in May 2020, amidst the pandemic, and it just dawned on me, I have very little to say about zoonotic disease. And I actually take that to be a symptom of what kind of life and discourse is like within American animal agribusinesses. I tried to write a pretty ethnographic book, right? One that would, the further research I did after my period of in-person research would really pick up and accentuate the themes I encountered. And I had to realize after that, talk of zoonotic illness in this place that's just saturated with animal life was completely non-present. Indeed, in an almost odd way. I was there in 2010. And so one of the things I was doing was working in a barn and artificially inseminating sows, literally sitting in that company on the back of sows, imitating the mounting of a boar. And, you know, this is 2010. This is right in the wake of swine flu allegedly appearing in Mexico. And I'm even asking all my coworkers, like, you know, we're surrounded by 3,000 pigs. Were you ever worried? And they're like, oh, no, we didn't think of it. No one talks about it. No one says anything. As I'm going to try to make clear in a bit, I think that's actually pretty indicative of the state of American agriculture. They are obsessed with pig disease, as we'll talk about. They're obsessed with animal illness, like diseases that only ostensibly affect hogs, that slow down their rate of growth, that decreases the size of litters and so forth. But the human side of it was not really treated as a potential issue at all. And the last thing I'll just say on this, Celia might find this to be an absurd point. I don't know, I'm road testing this, but I do guess there is a bit of a question here, though, which is, what do we mean by zoonotic disease, especially in contexts like factory farms, whereby human workers and animals are really entangled and codependent. I tell some stories about biosecurity in my book. To say it in brief, managers were very concerned about animal diseases, not ones that affect human beings in a health sense, animal diseases transferring across workers' bodies when they were outside of work. And they were very concerned, say, that someone who works in a breeding boar stud might be living with someone who works in a slaughterhouse, and that diseases might be transferring across their bodies and infecting hogs. And it's a long story, but they ended up starting to monitor workers' payroll forms and ensuring that people's kinship and family life and out-of-work sociality to some extent matched onto the division of labor and life that they had made with pigs. So we have this illness that essentially does not affect humans, but controlling it in these circumstances necessitates interventions into human life. Conversely, I think we all, or many of us probably know the stories of COVID and the ways that, you know, even if COVID doesn't grievously affect pigs, the fact that they simply could not get enough workers into slaughterhouses and so forth led to, you know, different kinds of death, I guess we could say, for animals, animals being prematurely killed through gassing and so forth, right? That in some senses, it just makes me think, as much as I did not encounter any discussions in that time, in that massive site of animal production of zoonoses, both pig diseases and so-called human diseases, including COVID, a zoonotic one, both mutually impacted each of these species, which again, perhaps just speaks to their entanglement.
All right, that was so amazing. I would also like to start by thanking Luísa, Fernando, and the APPH for creating this really wonderful opportunity for us all to be in dialogue. And I'm so delighted to be a co-panelist with Alex, whose work I also admire tremendously. It's such an amazing piece of ethnography that he's produced. So thank you all for inviting me to participate. I love that Alex went first, because I'd really like to connect on to a few things that he said, so that the way I describe my work makes for a coherent conversation for us. So I call myself a viral ethnographer. And by that, I mean someone who studies ethnographically the human-animal virus relations, and specifically, what is the connection between viruses and multi-species sociality and interactions that allow viruses to change our world, right? And that this is something that's easy for us to understand now. If we had this conversation 2 years ago, it would have seemed a little abstract, right? But viruses have been changing human and animal worlds forever. In fact, viruses were probably present at the start of mammalian life, enabling such things as the development of the mammalian placenta. Viruses are us, I guess. So my work has been, I've had one major virus project in Indonesia in the mid 2000s up till the present day, I would really say, looking at the H5N1 avian influenza outbreak. And then also, I worked with my colleague Ursula Munster at the Rachel Carson Center in Munich, and we wrote together about the elephant endotheliotropic herpes virus, or EEHV, which is a virus that's an extinction threat for elephants, both in captive and wild, so-called wild situations. And so really, my work has centered around these questions of sociality in relation to viruses, but also taking an STS approach and really saying, you have to know something about, to do what I do, you have to know something about viruses, how they work, what they are, where you find them, and viral evolution is key to all that. So when Alex was saying that the idea of the factory farms that he was doing his ethnographic work on, the main idea was to produce an identical part in the mechanical process, right? To produce completely identical pigs. Well, that's one of the key parts of the theory of evolution, right? Is that there's always variation. And so, you know, you're fighting evolution to think that you're going to produce identical hogs. And the thing is, it's in this variation that you get viral evolution, and it's a combination between the virus and the animal body and the physical context that the animal and the virus are in, right? The physical context set up by a human, some human group, right? That creates the possibility for these viral mutations that give us things like COVID, the COVID virus, right? So, you know, so the thing that has always been the most interesting to me in following the natural science of viruses, to understand them enough to connect them to the social worlds that I care about, is that the viruses like the H5N1 influenza are actually viruses of our own making. And they're made exactly within the kinds of industrial animal production that Alex described so beautifully. So I can tell you just briefly how a virulent avian influenza virus evolves. You put 1 million chickens all inside of a enclosed space. The air is full of ammonia so that the trachea and all of the breathing apparatus is burned out, right? So you've got chickens who are living on top of each other. They might have been debeaked with a hot knife. And so they're incredibly stressed. They're completely immunocompromised. And the other thing is that there's no evolutionary cost to the virus to kill its host, because the other one is actually sitting on top of it or under it or around it, right? So that's how virulence becomes selected for in the context of these industrial situations. There's just no cost to killing off your host because the other ones are all new hosts are always there, right? So I've found in my work, sort of starting with some of the properties of the virus, has been really productive. So with elephant EEHV, the elephant herpes virus, you know, in humans that, so a herpes virus is the chicken pox, it's the sore that people get on their lips, that kind of thing. And you know that those viruses come and they go, like chickenpox. You get it as a kid, it goes dormant in your body, and then when you're 60 years old or 70 years old, it comes out as shingles, right? So that's the key property of the herpes virus, the idea that it withdraws and recedes, and then it emerges again to cause devastation in this really unexpected way. So this idea of emergence, building on the properties of the virus, allowed us to, Ursula Munster and I, to analyze what was really going on with how humans were interacting with the virus, and the possibility and the potentiality of the disease. For me, the most interesting thing about studying viruses in a multi-species mix is that you can't go back and get the historical depth that Alex can get for hog breeding, right? Because we didn't know that viruses existed and have any way to see them through electron microscopy until about the 1930s. So they're relatively new things. And also their key property really is that they're invisible. So that you can see in our present COVID situation, that's exactly the property of the virus that allows for conspiracy theory, right? Because people can't, if you have a horse in front of you, you can have a debate over what the horse intends or how to ride the horse or all these things, but the horse is there. When you have a virus, people can say, I don't believe that this disease even exists, right? Because you can't see it. So it really takes an alliance, some kind of alliance with natural science and natural scientists to be able to say something about the virus's role inside of this larger social scene. And that leads me to my final point, is that there are different kinds of scientists. And I know that I believe Alex has also used the work of Rob Wallace. He has a book called Big Farms Make Big Flu. And he's a Marxist phylogeographer. And his work, as someone who can understand historical materialism, his scientific work is so much richer. And it tells us that we are making this virus through our human social practices. The virus itself is not some natural emergence, right? But so that we have scientists who are doing really different kinds of work, and some scientists are able to attach their biological knowledge to our human worlds, and others don't have an interest in that or are not adept at it.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. We just have a class about how a virus actually evolves in the industrial farming of chickens. That was amazing. And here in Brazil, the Rob Wallace's book was translated like last year, just in the middle of pandemics. And it was a huge thing for us here. It is being very a point of discuss here. So I will get into the other question that I have here. So I keep thinking about Celia's work when you described the intense and close contact between humans and their chickens in Indonesia. People raise their chickens in their backyards, have cockfights with them, take care of them, and pets and also as foods. All these kinds of close proximity with the birds can represent a source of risk and contamination in the context of avian flu. But in contrast to this kind of backyard animals, one could think that in industrial spaces, there will be less or even no close contact with the animals. But Alex shows us in his work quite the opposite, that factory farms are full of intimate human-animal contact. For example, in the early stages of a pig's life, the weak piglets often need to be fed manually by human workers, since the industrial production of animals also means that female pigs will have so many piglets that they cannot feed them all. So it seems to be that in an industrial farm, there is no less contact between humans and pigs than in the backyard creation of chickens. But the thing is that the type of intimacy in the factory farms is mediated, supposedly controlled, hygienic, standardized, and also culturally exercised. That is supposedly free of any emotional or personal engagement with animals. And also with no trace of cultural expression, since most workers in swine production are immigrants. And that's a big point, I guess. So pigs need to be seen as an economic creature, as a final product and not as an animal. And I think that Alex already told us earlier that a little about why it is so necessary to avoid any variation in production. So in industrial settings, one should only be interacting with the animals in certain ways, which are regulated by protocols, while other types of contact are not considered safe or adequate and can be seen as a source of contamination. For example, in Celia's work, we can see that domestic chickens were seen as a possible source of H5N1 infection to the human population. And then finally, we ask you if you can talk about how these cases, when we look at security issues, we are also looking to the operation of a whole moral regime, of how biosecurity discriminates against some forms of relationships, making them dangerous, while trying to cultivate other intimacies considered safe.
You want to try to take it first, Celia?
There was a whole lot in there. I mean, so much of the question centered around the conditions in the factory farming, which Alex is in a much better position to speak about than I am. The only thing I would say perhaps is that, you know, there are multiple kinds of biosecurity, and I think they all have different, you know, they bring different things to light. You know, so I think, for example, environmental security, food security, health security, these are all different kinds of forms of securitizing human practices. And I think you're right. I think you mentioned, Luísa, that they really began to, I mean, not on-farm biosecurity, that's perhaps a little bit older, but many new forms of securitization began to emerge after September 11th. But that wasn't a complete breaking point. These things were also going on earlier than that. So for example, when I studied biodiversity conservation in Indonesia in the 1990s, at about the end of my research, that is when the idea of securitizing securitizing wildlife really began to emerge and blossom. Before that, there was many conversations about community-based resource management. How do we bring communities in? You know, less about ideas of care for animals, but really more, you know, care for communities, people who live in rural parts of Indonesia or Indonesian citizens. We don't want the authoritarian government taking their land away from them. But it was really around 2000 when the discourse changed to one of making wildlife secure from human engagement. And health security is the same thing and has about the same temporality. If you think about what came before a kind of health security approach, population health would have been the rubric that was operating before that. So ideas about making sure everyone in the rural population had vitamin A or had pregnancy vitamins or had vaccinations, so that the population itself was healthy. The minute you move to health security, you all of a sudden are talking about securitizing the national economy, for example, instead of people's health. And so there's this real moment right about that time, which predates 9/11, but got boosted by it, I think, or turbocharged by it, when the idea of securitizing, approaching our world through a securitized sociality, I guess is how I would say it, rather than one that involved more a sense of care. A care for populations. Do I want to say anything else? I guess I would say probably there's some difference between what I'm describing and on-farm biosecurity. And yeah, I don't know which way Alex wants to take it, but in my work, I might I might make a slight distinction between those technical practices and a securitization of the social. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd love to hear how you make the distinction. I feel I only really know agricultural biosecurity, which indeed I think is a very specific thing. If I'm not mistaken, and this might not be exactly right, one of the earliest mentions of biosecurity as a term is from the 70s in chicken farms, Tyson Foods chicken farms, before it ramps up to be adopted in New Zealand and to some extent Australia before, and then to September 11th. And yeah, the wide meanings of biosecurity really hit home for me, I think, when I read parts of Joseph Moscow's The Theater of Operations, where he notes that adjusted for inflation, I think this is right, adjusted for inflation, after September 11th, the United States spent more on biosecurity than it did the nuclear Manhattan Project. Without quite a sense of exactly what it is they're spending on. I remember in graduate school, many of my roommates were biology students that were all on biosecurity funding. And so it's just seemingly an expansive array. How do I want to approach this? We started a little bit about distance and intimacy, right? And maybe I'll start there. On factory farms. Before I got into this project, I heard, a lot of the common lament is that things like factory farms distance so-called us, or distance human beings from animal life. And that's indeed what it looks like from the outside, right? You see all of these chickens or pigs locked in barns, seemingly closed off from the world, not visible from a field or what have you. But I think that accepting that plays too closely into the industry's own fantasies. They would love, the pork industry in the United States would love a scenario where they could raise and kill pigs with machines, where they did not have to have humans making contact with them, but they cannot do that. And I think COVID revealed just the extent to which they cannot do that when people suddenly realize that there are 3,000 people working in a slaughterhouse, or thousands working across an array of barns. I don't see factory farms as necessarily distancing humans and hogs per se. I get where that's coming from. In a different sense, I see them as hyper-industrial. And by what I mean by that is I think they do pay less per pound of pork in total labor hours, right? There is less money in these operations, and in the grand scheme, less quantitative labor time put into every pig and so forth. But yet, they do require the few people that remain within these barns, maybe 5-6 people that work in a barn that annually raises 10,000 pigs, to work in just hyper productive ways and in really quite intimate relationships with pigs. And what I found, how I would describe an industrial animal, or the process of gradually industrializing and reindustrializing animals, is simply one of trying to mediate more and more of these animals' life and death course through labor, right? A pretty good example is the rise of artificial insemination, and then sub-steps to artificial insemination, as different processes that animals used to do become now tinged in and through labor. Much of my work is really just moving through the animal's pre-life to kind of post-death course to see these companies trying to get people working more directly on every single facet of animal existence, to the point where, in one of the odder cases, a person I worked with spent 2 hours every morning spraying iodine on pigs' sores, right? Especially from pigs lying around all day. He would walk through the barn and try to spray iodine in them to stave off infections, right? And this person, for 2 hours of the day, essentially just worked on the porcine epidermis, right? He just worked on the skin, and the particular scale and density of production made it in that specific case that people in new ways had to work on pig skin just to keep them, keep them from lameness or infection and so forth. What I basically found across my research was everyone had become more or less specialized into a specific life function or physiological function of the pig. If someone worked extracting semen in a boar stud, that was what they did, partly for biosecurity reasons. If someone worked in artificial insemination, that was what they did all day. I think this is a process that's built over time, but more and more people are working on one life stage, one physiological process. If you work with piglets, you really just work with piglets aged day one to 21. And what I saw there was both that all of these new array of labor tasks were partially to keep pigs alive in these really brutal conditions that Celia previously talked about with chickens. Sometimes they were trying to create more uniformity in pigs, but I also think that these companies actually came to rely on workers' profound knowledge, the kind of knowledge that only really emerges when you help deliver 200,000 piglets in a year or something like that. And the result is that workers come to have a certain kind of intimacy with pigs, but a decidedly partial one, right? When I would call capitalist intimacy layered onto capitalist divisions of labor, which is that, people might work with piglets or even just day one old piglets for years and years and years, but never encounter a boar, or never encounter a fully grown hog, and so forth, but have really quite radical knowledge of that one stage. And I think to some extent that this has become that kind of like profound, but also partial knowledge and skill has become necessary in these industries because they are simply so fragile, right? That the pigs are so easily prone to illness that, even disturbing a pig in the wrong way can potentially lead to miscarriages across a barn, where as you mentioned before, the piglets are so overproduced with such large litters that they're emerging in quite weak conditions, and you really need people with expertise to care for them. This system has grown and grown indefinitely. And in so doing, I think it's become more of a balancing act. It's become more fragile. It's required more extensive forms of human labor and quite intimate, if we want to use that word, labor, in ways that are tricky to manage, and just means an ongoing and deepening kind of co-constitution of industrial pig and industrial labor. And I will just say, into your earlier question there, what I'm trying to get at here as well is just how easy it is for something to go wrong here when you start increasing scales of animal production, where you start increasing the amount of people that have to be involved in different tasks along the way. When you increase the fragility of animals such that a mistaken stroke or a casual stroke on a pig's back can cause it to get very upset, that could cause miscarriages, or when it gets to the point where, in theory, if you're just sitting on the couch with a friend from a different part of the workplace, the diseases can transfer across your body and make pigs sick. That I think that the irony here is that I think these companies would love to have barns and slaughterhouses that operated without human labor, but they are instead very dependent on human labor, but labor that itself can be a threat to these fragile, is necessary to these hogs, but it can also be a threat to them. And it results in a situation where increasing dimensions of human life, from where people live to their how they react and even sometimes speak and act around animals, can, in the mind of some of these corporate actors and managers, become increasingly bio-insecure over time.
Thank you, Alex and Celia. A lot to think about this one, I think. But
I might just jump in and say something. You know, as Alex was speaking and he was describing, you know, the life of these diminished hogs, but also what just screams out from his work and the text is and how he was describing it now is the diminished life of the farm, of the worker, you know, and it's just so heart-wrenching to think of, you know, to have gone from farmers who managed multiple species and seasonalities and infrastructure to someone whose only real task is to put iodine on the skin of a pig over and over again. And you know, I was thinking back to one of the questions that Luísa sent us before we started about what I think about in how Indonesian people relate to animals and backyard, you know, backyards where everyone has chickens and they're not all of the industrial variety, you know, and what that life is like. And it certainly has its difficulties, but comparing it to this sort of being part of this larger machine, you know, but just sort of thinking through to what extent we want to romanticize the Indonesian backyard farm, because it does have the capacity to further transmit things like avian influenza. As I've argued, following Rob Wallace, it doesn't create those viruses in the same way or at the same speed. But, you know, how do we think about conditions of farming and farm labor and what it means to, you know, throw a handful of rice sort of out the door each day versus, you know, what it means to be part of, as a human, the experience of being part of the larger factory organization and the vulnerabilities that you experience as part of that larger institutional setting. That's just what that's what was going through my mind as Alex was speaking.
And just on that note, I think one of the things I've really taken from your work, Celia, that I saw very much in the American pork production context was just the radical incompatibility of things like industrial chickens and backyard birds, right? Especially in the story that you so compellingly tell of perhaps industrial barns incubating, for lack of a better word, viruses that then once they get out escape. And I saw minor, relatively more minor instances of this all the time, like you know, corporations investing a great deal of money to try to eradicate some disease, and then one kind of show pig 2 miles downwind that's held outdoors, it ends up infecting one of the barns, and it just moves through the entire production network in ways that just I think it's a really important point, especially in a time when we hear so much of like discourse of the market will allow some people to produce industrial pigs and others to produce niche pigs or something like that, or small scale backyard animals, but actually in real geographic space, these two types of pigs or chickens seem to really struggle to coexist to the point where it seems to almost necessitate the eradication of one or the other.
Yeah, and so that's physically and also discursively they're being made incompatible, right? Because the backyard farmer in Indonesia is being blamed for the outbreak, you know, despite the fact that H5N1 was probably brought in, you know, in boxes of day-old chicks coming from Thailand to the Indonesian industrial context. So, yeah. I forget where I was going with that, but yeah.
Thank you, guys, for this wonderful explanation about a lot of things, actually. Yes, there is an overlap, but between different types of animal creation, but it isn't made possible or desirable. So that's very interesting. And I think you already mentioned a bit of our next question, but we would like to make it. So Celia mentions that relationships with companion species, such as the chicken Celia mentioned, can be sometimes described through a vocabulary of shared love, care, curiosity, pleasure. But multi-species relationships are also predatory, invasive, infectious, or even pathogenic. So the way that the United States reacted to the avian flu outbreaks in Indonesia contrasts with the way which the Indonesians themselves reacted to the outbreaks. So if on the one hand, the USA seemed to militarize the disease with their biosecurity apparatus, spreading terror and specific moralities. And by that, we mean like specific ways in which people should behave and how they should treat their animals, and spread even more poverty in Indonesia because people would stop for a while of raising their own chickens. And on the other hand, the Indonesians seem to oppose this alarming narrative as they noticed the flu wasn't killing as many people as the American media was saying. So there seems to be in the global north a desire for control and a fantasy of separation that permeates the biosecurity imaginary. But when we arrive in Indonesia, we can find other concerns that do not resonate with these narratives of control. We think in both Blanchette's and Lowe's work, there is an emphasis that the absolute separation between humans, animals, and microorganisms is impossible and not even desirable. So if we are getting this right, and I ask Celia to correct us if we're not, there seems to be in the Indonesian response to the avian flu, a radical perception that processes of health, sickness, and death are a part of life. So that multi-species relationships are in fact potentially dangerous, but there is no such a thing as a desire or interest to purify them. That does not mean that Indonesians are not health conscious or that they do not believe in the virus, but it means that safety is not always a synonym for health, and militarizing health is not the best way to deal with these relationships. So we ask, do you think that maybe the best way or one way to put the problem is how could we learn to live with those who we don't necessarily want to live with, such as viruses and other pathogenic microorganisms?
Should I go? Or yeah, okay. Well, thank you for that. You know, there was so much in there that my mind is jumping back and forth. I think your last question, how do we learn to live with incompatible things, people, species is, you know, the question of the day. But, you know, I wanted to start where you were starting to talk about multi-species work in general and how the piece that you quoted, I was saying that, a lot of multi-species work is or where maybe where it started a while back was looking at how much more sentient animals are than we ever expected. And that there are, showing animals as having all these capacities for love, for communication, that extended way beyond the sort of 1960s and 70s. Oh, they can use a tool or something like that, right? So we show them having these rich, complex lives. But I was really interested in sticking with the dimension of virulence. You can study microbes, as many have, for the way they help us make bread or wine, or the way they have helped, as I mentioned earlier, build the human placenta. And I think those are all really important ways to take multi-species work and viral ethnography. But I was really interested in this idea of virulence because, I thank my lucky stars right now that I never really came out strongly and said that the H5N1 influenza thing was a farce. Because now that COVID-19 has proved to be a global pandemic, you can see how that actually there was something going on. There was something emergent. It could have been this, and it might have been worse than this if it was this. Instead, we have COVID. There'll be the next global pandemic at the rate at which we are changing our relationships with the natural world. It may not be 100 years before we get the next pandemic. So for me, that's why I was really, I really liked working with this idea of virulence. I can tell you a story. One of the symptoms of having been exposed to avian influenza, in a sort of mild way, is to get an eye sty, conjunctivitis. And one day I took my 2.5-year-old daughter back then to the bird market in Yogyakarta, and we came back, and the next day she came down with a serious case of conjunctivitis. And, I realized that, like, how cavalier did I want to be with my 2.5-year-old, going through the bird market at a time of viral emergence like that. And, so I think, I think to say we just have to learn to live with difficult others is probably too simplistic. I mean, I personally got vaccinated for COVID. I'm glad there are biologists out there who figured all that out. And it's not something that I personally wanted to mess with. So then instead of sort of saying, how do we all live harmoniously together? For me, the questions really centered around care as opposed to security. And that was the key thing for me, how to bring back or reinforce this idea of care and caring relationships. And that would be care for, obviously, humans who have the potential to get sick, humans who own livestock, humans who are trying to make a livelihood, humans who might have diminished lives. It involves caring for animals that, do we really want to live in a world where in order to eat chicken, we need to take a hot knife and take the beaks off of all the animals? So care for animals, but also in the elephant virus article that I wrote with Ursula, care also meant paying close attention to what viruses, to the best we can figure out, are actually doing and capable of. And one example we had of caring, we had an example that I wrote about the Woodland Park Zoo here in Seattle, near where I live, where the zoo keepers were only able to care about the elephant as part of a species survival plan. They could not care about the individuals as suffering animals in this cold weather where they're confined to 1 square mile for 40 years. So they couldn't take up elephants as a who that you might care about. They could only take care of them as part of their species collective. But at the same time, the protesters who really wanted the Woodland Park Zoo to turn its elephants over to a sanctuary were completely unable to care about the virus or about species survival, because they were only focused on this one aspect of the elephant as a who. And so I think we need to bring care in this complex way where we can care for humans, we can care for elephants or chickens or hogs, but we can also care about what prosthetic ways we have for gaining greater, more or less accurate knowledge about viruses and their conditions of evolution. So evolution to virulence, evolution to helpfulness in a bred yeast condition. You know, and viruses are really complicated to apply this term care to. It's really challenging, especially if you're interested in the virulence question. But that's why I would think somebody like Rob Wallace is giving much more care to the virus, because he's describing the conditions of their evolution so much more accurately than simply a plain phylogeographer or phylogeneticist who just wants to know the little squares with the boxes that tell you what came from what, right? They tell you this form evolved from this form, but they don't tell you that this form evolved from this form under conditions where hogs are shipped from China to Mexico and mix with, you know, I mean, some in the 2009 swine flu epidemic, there were poultry, human, and hog porcine viral genes, influenza genes, all mixed up together. So they were all to care about that virus would mean to actually care about the conditions under which this evolution is happening, not simply that something evolved into something else.
Thank you for that. I'll try to pick up quickly on this, and really just a part of your question, Luísa. I really liked how you put in your question, safety is not a synonym for health. And I think from within animal agribusiness, I think we'd also want to reverse that or inverse that. Health is not a synonym for safety. There is so much focus in, say, the United States on generating an animal that ideally, it never works out like this, of course, but there's so much pressure and attempts to generate an animal that is not sick for its short 6 months of life, right? That does not become sick. The use of prophylactic antibiotics are exactly that, to sort of stave off disease in ways that, you know, as I've written about elsewhere, and many of people have written about, you know, bring significant risks of antibiotic resistance, right? You know, even the sheer age at which animals are killed in the United States. I really appreciated Celia's moment a little while back where she sort of stepped back and said, okay, let's put this spraying iodine on pig's skin in a broader context of the other relationships to animals around the world and historically. It's a minor point, but I don't think we appreciate enough the fact that virtually all farm animals in the United States are killed as the equivalent of teenagers, right? And so I look to the photographer Isa Leshko's work, Allowed to Grow Old is her book, that goes to animal sanctuaries and takes pictures of elderly animals, just to show that, like, I've interacted with many thousands, if not millions of pigs, and I have never encountered an elderly hog. Indeed, the majority of a hog's life stage I have never experienced. And indeed, scholars of sanctuaries like Ilana Brell or Heather Rosenfeld show us that actually there exists very little veterinary knowledge for how to care for a chicken that is 1 year old, or how to care for a pig that is 3 years old, because the entire apparatus of health in these operations has been built around antibiotic dosed teenagers, right? As animals. At the same moment as you have this almost perversely healthy pig that all these companies are only trying to find ways to make healthier and healthier and healthier, right? Surplus health amongst surplus health. These animals, as Celia pointed out before, are immunocompromised, living cramped lives, standing on top of manure and waste all day, with lesions, with blocked instinctual behaviors at every twist and turn. The slaughterhouses are beset with worker injuries, and the next major disease is at the door. So yeah, I do think that the US, we need to be able to live with unpredictability, variability, sickness, slowdowns, contingency to some extent. But just on the question of, do we need to live well with certain pathogens? Do we need to? Maybe. Yeah, but I think this is building in part with Celia's comments. I'd also like us to take seriously and really push for a form of care that includes the abolishment of certain life forms and forms of life. That does not just accept, which can be, I don't want to exaggerate this, a risk in some multi-species work, that does not just accept that we need to find ways to live with or live otherwise alongside some existing lives and conditions of terror and tragedy. From forever chemicals or climate change, there's many horrible things we're probably going to have to live with. But I just say this to say, I am not very invested. If we're talking about living better with the industrial pig, for instance, which is where this question can go, I am not invested at all in the question of how to live and work better in factory farms. And I think it's a really important baseline principle, especially for those of us in American and Canadian academia, where agribusiness is constantly recruiting scientists at every moment to try to find one little twist, one little technology, one feed additive, one thing to moderately improve these situations. It is rife, and I don't take this as a posture. I think as scholars, we need to insist it would be disruptive, especially to particular rural areas like the one I lived in a while. But I think we have to insist as a principle that my aspiration is to actually not have pigs, and some people have to live like this to be, yeah.
That's so great. That takes it, for me, that helps me to see beyond just virulent viruses, right? Which I know we don't, which I believe we don't want to accommodate ourselves to, but we also don't want to accommodate ourselves to producing industrial pigs. Yeah.
That produce virulent, violent viruses.
Right. A whole bunch of bad stuff stirred up together.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just about learning to live with virus, but learning to live with an old hog, an old pig, and an old chicken, changing, the way that we are relation to the animals. Maybe we don't have to relate with viruses at this point, like coronavirus that we are living for. We start to think about care in this sense, and this is very interesting in the way that biosecurity does not product, as we are seeing, do not produce knowledge about viruses at all. I think the apparatus of biosecurity do not produce knowledge of viruses and how to deal with them in other sense, so
or antibiotic resistance, right, as well.
Yeah.
Luísa, should we go to question number 5?
I'm trying to find it out here in the document.
Okay.
Actually, I think I want to skip for come back for multispecies studies, because that's interesting. How do you make a multispecies approach in your work? Because Alex brings to bear a discussion on the anthropology of work and labor. That's a whole specific anthropologic line, and he makes an multispecies approach. So, and Celia, for other way, is talking about the production of scientific knowledge, right? There is another line of anthropology studies. So how do you make this how do you mobilize this different knowledge for a multi-species interest?
Should I go for it, Sharp? I mean, I'll be interested to see what I could have been misteaching Celia for 8 years now, but I've always felt that Celia's 2010 piece for me, and it's kind of attempt to do an ethnography of a virus, right? Ethnography of entanglement and assemblage was really about trying to rethink what context is in a sort of way. I really think when I was even doing work on pig farms, after reading that piece, it's when it said, like, made me question, where am I? And even if I'm not in the barns or something like that, what kinds of relationships or relations am I experiencing through things like airborne manure or different saturated in the kind of cloud, if you will, of pig diseases and so forth. Like, where was I actually? Yeah, I don't know. The multi-species literature has inspired me quite a bit. I mean, I could list off a bunch of the inspirations it's given me. You know, from attention to interspecies care and interspecies relations as significant aspects of people's lives, even within factory farms, to really the ways it's, at least the animal studies side of it, has really pushed for attunement to the actually existing diversity of creatures, right? It's allowed me to think about the ways that, like, an industrial pig is different from another pig that might live outdoors, or a pig with different genetics. Like, there is a multiplicity to all of these different species. I'll just put it in simple terms as to what the multi-species literature did for me. So if you remember, in 2010, as a graduate student, I was doing this project. And when Celia's piece came out in cultural anthropology, along with like Eva Hayward and Jake Kosek's work on honeybees, I was literally artificially inseminating hogs at that time, right? And I started this book, you know, with maybe a fleeting sense of Donna Haraway's work and so forth, but I was really doing like labor studies and labor organizing. And I said to myself, I'm going into this place to really center workers' perspectives and to really advocate for worker justice in these places. And that is, if anyone's read my book, something I do very much care about. I unapologetically, well, I'd apologize, but I think that's important. But I think the multi-species literature, based on work in factory farms, say, made it pretty clear to me how inadequate that approach is in and of itself. I was inspired a lot, say, by Timothy Potterat in his book, Every 12 Seconds, where he essentially calls out a lot of slaughterhouse ethnographies as being indistinguishable, oftentimes in content, from an ethnography of a tire plant, and kind of abstracting from the sense that this is the work of killing. And indeed, that many people who work within it see it just like that. I was inspired by like texts like Eric Schlosser's Fast Food Nation, really good piece of journalism, but which sort of shows what's the problem with industrial slaughterhouses. Well, before the breaking of the unions in the United States in the late 70s and early 80s, if workers made, you know, the adjusted for inflation, the contemporary equivalent of what they did, they'd be making like $36 an hour instead of the $13 an hour that they make. And, you know, that was attractive to me. But in the broader picture, I just kind of step back. An industrial slaughterhouse or a factory farm where people make $40 an hour is no utopia. It is no ideal sort of place. And indeed, in a broader sense, I just came to think that, and this is the multi-part maybe, that we just cannot separate human and animal well-being, or human concern for humans and concern for animals, so easily in these operations, right? When pigs are subjected to all sorts of diseases, it can, constrain how people live together. If your job is to spend all day working with kind of genetic, like industrial animals sickened by industrial genetics, that's about the quality of life and quality of work. But meanwhile, I think so much of pigs themselves have simply been shaped and made uniform to increase line speeds in slaughterhouses, right? To get more and more, subject pigs to all sorts of procedures and drugs and so forth, to make them more uniform so that you can increase the speed of work in a slaughterhouse and hence exploit workers. So in some senses, I saw the exploitation of pigs and the exploitation of workers as moving together in ways. So this is a kind of long way of saying, what did the multi-species work do for me? Well, in a sense, it and some other literatures pushed me to understand pigs and different kinds of pigs as subjects, right? And really made me think about how we cannot just develop a critique of the treatment of human workers in these operations, but instead we also have to be attuned to the critique of this kind of labor as such around pigs. And I won't get into it. It's a point I've thought with lines of Kathy Weeks and Moishka Stone and some kind of anti-productivist Marxist thinkers. But the story I'm telling in Porkopolis is one where pigs are just becoming more and more and more subject to capitalist industrial labor. And I do think the critique of the opening has to be, a pushback against how much labor ends up coursing through these animals. And for me, that multi-species literature ended up pushing me into a tension that I think recurs throughout the book. I don't resolve, but I think it's an important tension, which is simply like, how do you advocate for the rights, remuneration, knowledge, and perspective of actually existing workers while still holding open the possibility that these jobs should not exist at all? And I think that's tough, but I think it's an important orientation.
I would say, Alex, that what your work does so brilliantly, though, is like, I would turn it around the other way, rather than what multi-species work did for you, what you actually have done for multi-species work, because I'm personally am not interested in multi-species analyses for the aesthetics of it. I really appreciate Eben Kierkegaard's continuing question of cui bono, who benefits, right? So who is benefiting from the particular multi-species arrangements that, so what I come, my background, initially my graduate studies were in political ecology. So it was asking that question of who's benefiting from arrangements around biodiversity conservation, and who is made to suffer for the sake of other people's aesthetic views of nature, right? But in those early configurations of political ecology, the animals, the actual creatures who were going extinct weren't really included in that configuration. So, and in the question, in the line of inquiry. So I think, what Alex and the kinds of questions you're asking has done for radicalizing the multi-species genre is just, it's just invaluable, to ask some serious questions about, as Anna Singh says, living on a damaged planet. How are we going to think about relations on this planet where the damages are not prospective? Like, if we don't do such and such, we will have climate change. Rather, where we already have the industrial farm, we already have the climate change, we already have the species loss. What kinds of relations and relationships do we need? And with what configuration of actors at this particular moment in time? And you can't understand understand that without a sort of intellectual, but also gut sense of the suffering of workers. The suffering, you know, that some people suffer more than others in these configurations.
Mm.
I think, Celia, that what Alex just said goes with what you were saying about care shouldn't be restricted to just the animals, just the workers, and should be spread even to the viruses. So I think that's a really nice point. Fernando just told us that we could start to read some of the YouTube questions that came. Luisa, I think
I don't think they are not actually questions, but there are some commentaries that we can.
I think that Fernando's comments goes with what we were talking about now, and I will read the comment for you. Yeah, more comments than questions. So Fernando says, your point about not only standing for some worlds, some forms of coexistence, but against some worlds and forms of life is very important. It also makes us think about what is the role of anthropology, other sciences, and academic knowledge practices in standing for and against some worlds. So that was Fernando's comment. I think, Luisa, what do you think about asking question number 5?
No, I can take a shot at that.
Okay.
Thank you.
You know, the question of anthropology standing for and against other worlds, I obviously don't think that this is an innocent statement that I made before, right? That we should pursue the abolishment of factory farms, especially from where I'm coming from. So we spent a lot of time in a place that I care quite deeply about, and indeed that tried to make an effort to think through these situations, not only with workers, but also with managers who themselves feel deeply pressured under kind of capitalist dynamics to grow and grow and grow. And indeed, you know, didn't want to begin a project from the standpoint that, you know, the only question is how we do away with these very forms of, or how we encourage the transformation of these very forms of life and life forms of which we spent a lot of time with. So I think it's not innocent at all, and it's something that I struggle with. What's it mean to do long-term ethnography with long-standing commitments to sort of people, including people with very different lives from you, but also insist alongside some others that these spaces also require radical transformation. I don't have the answer to that. I would say that I wrote much of my book trying to think through and come to directions to approach that question without ever ultimately resolving it. But you know, I just think it's an important question, and I'll leave it with this: that where this is coming from for me is in the wake of COVID-19 and all of the infections in slaughterhouses. And I was giving talks in the wake of it, and oftentimes being asked what is to be done right now, like May, June, when you know, virtually every plant in the United States is just rampant with infections, where at that point it did not look like it could be controlled, whether it was because of the refrigeration or the proximity of labor. And my position was that they should be shut down. And certainly not my only, I was certainly not the only person with that position. And you know, that was not always greeted well in some anthropological and public discussions, where it was immediately the question is, well, what about the workers? Or, okay, but after the shutdown, what comes next, right? Like what's the productive form of life after? And I'm still working through some of this, but part of me just wants to insist that we don't need to describe and model and narrate the life that comes after, that there's you know, value in simply refusing these things and and being ultimately okay with them being shut down, right? It just seems that there's that moment in the US at that time when, and around the world, when it looked like these places would shut down. And it was interesting to me, as always interesting to me, to see how many resources, right up to including the President of the United States, were mobilized to try to keep them open. So we're in a funny moment where I don't think I've met anyone who thinks factory farms are an unmitigated good thing, but it's also hard to even articulate the position that they should simply be stopped as an end in of itself.
Celia, do you want to give a thought on it, or you can read some comments on share on YouTube?
Yeah, we can read some more comments. I guess I only have one very simple comment, which is that I'm not averse to, as part of my ethnographic practice, imagining new worlds. I think that's a pretty cool thing to do. And, you know, I'm thinking about some of the ways that Donna Haraway and her students work in thinking about, in sort of projecting new worlds. And, you know, sometimes it's like through science fiction and other media. Sometimes it's through art and art installations. But, you know, I think that's like a different kind of project than the documentary project. And so we can stop at any point. But it's kind of an interesting project to take on as well.
So am I with microphone? Okay, it is. So Je comments that One Health only reproduces the shape produced by global health. It is based on the separation between species as a solution to disease. We need shared care more than containment or separation policies. And before One Health, we need to recognize one disease, Anthropocene, maybe agribusiness. Maybe we can think about the difference between One Health approach and a multi-species health logic. You know, what's the difference between One Health approach and a multi-species approach on health?
Personally, I don't know that I can say that much about One Health. I haven't actually studied it. I know it exists. You know, off the top of my head, I think it's a more managerial approach. I don't know, Alex, do you know about One Health?
It's nothing. I can't comment extensively on it. I'll just say an anecdote. One of the things that got me really thinking about biosecurity in and around the management of pig disease, and particularly the reconfiguration of workers' lives to try to keep, you know, pigs growing faster and faster and faster without illness, was the ways that some managers were talking about One Health in those early moments in 2010, which, if I'm not mistaken, part of the idea of One Health was to bring veterinary medicine and environmental medicine on more of an even playing field with human health. But I think a lot of agribusiness corporations were really excited for One Health and the kinds of flow that it would result into veterinary medicine. Again, a veterinary medicine in that case that is entirely geared towards, you know, pigs aged 1 day to 6 months, or chickens aged even younger. So it's just a comment, and is perhaps in line with what Celia mentioned as a managerial sensibility that in many agribusinesses greeted the initial discussions of One Health as something that would be a boon in research to allow them to, again, radically ramp up pig proliferation. So not like an evening, but it was interpreted in some senses like a an elevation of these specific kinds of animal lives health over.
Yeah, I get the, maybe if we had to strike up a difference between One Health and a multi-species health approach, is that One Health is really, how do we keep our world the way it is and not have it spin off more risk and more problems, whereas a multi-species health would be more along the lines of what Alex was describing as a world that just doesn't have industrial factory farms in it, so because you can't, in the same way that I experienced with the vets and staff at the Woodland Park Zoo, the way they couldn't take up the elephant as a who, as a individual with a life history and an experience of suffering. I don't think there's any part of One Health that was ever intended to do that. So that's where multi-species health could really come in, because you would have to think about each of the creatures, human or non-human, in the configuration as a who had a complex life history.
And I don't know if I'm lively enough at this late hour to get this on the table properly, but when you were speaking, Celia, I immediately started thinking of some of Donna Haraway's earlier attention to flourishing, and particularly asking not just does an animal feel pain, but can an animal work? Can an animal play? And what would it mean to expand perhaps what animal health includes and what it means to have a healthy life, which it seems are questions that maybe a multi-species health would ask, not just the maintenance of a base healthiness condition or so forth, but to treat as an open question, what is a healthy animal, a healthy life, or a life worth pursuing?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great thread. And I think also in that thread, we can't forget her history as a feminist scholar, and where some of these ideas came out of her feminist orientation and background and learning, because these ideas of care and flourishing, came out of thinking through the role of women and others in society, and what is caring work, and when is caring work a burden and a form of incarceration, and when is it actually a form of wisdom, or something that we want more of rather than less of.
Thank you. So we have a question from Everson on YouTube that we'll read to you, and then I think that we can go to final comments after that. So he says that in Brazil, talking about agribusiness necessarily means talking about indigenous populations, not only the invasion of indigenous lands, but the contamination of rivers, food, and the arrival of pathogens. Also thinking about the guarantee of indigenous lands as a guarantee of health. Another day, an indigenous leader said that with no land, they would become sick. So Everson asks, how to think about biosecurity in this context?
Well, I really love and appreciate that the example from Brazil is on the table, and I only wish we had brought it out earlier and had more time to learn from you all how this intersects with contemporary conditions in Brazil. But all I can really say, I think, is yes. Yes, absolutely. I think indigeneity, like I was just mentioning feminism, but indigeneity and indigenous knowledges and indigenous demands for rights to health and histories and land you know, I think in some scholars' work does and can definitely become prominent as an element of multi-species work and multi-species relations. So yes, very important.
And he added that in this case that he mentioned, the conception of health is not one health, neither multi-species health, because it also includes spirits that habitated the different worlds in different cosmologies. It was a nice comment.
I guess so, the form of study is, you know, thinking about it, it's not just multi-species work, but also new materialism and thinking about how all the forms, living and non-living, that come together in an assemblage, you know, have material effects and consequences. You know, so in that case, spirits become, in a sort of new materialist framework, spirits are a thing, an element in the assemblage, because they have agency and consequences and can be acted upon as well. So I think there's other work we could also bring into the conversation in addition to the multi-species work when we go in that direction.
Jean even added also that here in Brazil, especially in South Brazil, there is a huge part of the workforce of slaughterhouses is indigenous people from Brazil. So there is another layer of complexity, we think, in this, what kind of multi-species work we're talking about, or what kind of labor issues we're talking about. So I love that comment too. Guys, I think we'll be coming to the end of our conversation, but we'll leave it open for any final considerations, any comments. So feel free to add anything. And we would like to thank you very much for the whole conversation. I made a lot of notes here, and I will watch it again after, but we would like to thank you very much for all until now.
Thank you all.
Yeah, I really just appreciated the opportunity to discuss with you and discuss with Alex. It's been a great event.
Likewise, and conversely, I'd also really like to learn more about these particular issues in Brazil. A context for agribusiness that, of course, is so globally important, not just through JBS, or not just through dominated conversations around soy crops or feed crops, but I would relish the opportunity to think more comparatively about all of these issues.
Okay, so I want to thank Luísa and Luísa for organizing this great activity, and of course Celia and Alex for wanting to join us and for teaching us so much tonight. I would like to remind everyone that we have 2 conversations incoming 2 weeks from now. On the 25th, it will be the conversation that I have organized myself with Jan Zalesiewicz and Eva Horn. The conversation is called "The Case for the Anthropocene 20 Years Later." And on the end of that week, the 29th, we'll have the conversation "Atlases, Images, and Narratives, Gathering as a Way of Thinking," bringing together Lily Carr, Annelise De Carli, and Leo Chichibo. So we will be very happy to see you again. And once again, thank you, Celia, Alex, Luísa, and Luísa, and we hope to see you soon again.
Thank you, everyone. I love this roundtable. It was amazing. Thank you very much. Let's make one about a Brazilian situation that we are actually trying to study. And let's make another one. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.